Welcome back to the Chattervast podcast. I'm your host, Chad. Thanks again for tuning in on our second episode. And I mentioned in the first episode that I'd see you tomorrow, which I did not post the next day. I've spent a day off from that. Life is busy, as you know, and I'm still working out what days I'll be recording and posting podcasts and YouTube videos. And I'll let you know as soon as I have some kind of system down. I'm thinking either Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday. Just haven't figured that out. But I'd like to start off today, of course, with a little bit of news. But before that, I thought some good news would be a good idea to start out with. And so if you go to mediafacts.ro, which is a Romanian news website, I came across this and I thought this was really interesting. I haven't seen anything like it in American media, but if you click on Vești Bune, which is good news, basically, this is all in Romanian, but your browser should allow you to just click and translate to English. But they just have good news, which at this moment is all related to COVID. I just thought it was really interesting that you'd have a news site with a section dedicated to just having good news. And this one's more about like some of the cures that they're working on, or the vaccines, and that you can have a consultation via like Zoom or something like that. But I thought that'd be a really interesting thing to have on a news website if you could get some of the American news media to put that up. And if you remember earlier this year, John Krasinski, who was in The Office and in that movie that I can't recall the name of at the moment, but he was doing a special podcast, or not podcast, but a YouTube channel that was called Some Good News Network, and he dedicated the entire thing just to like having good news, which after the whole fact, he ended up selling it off, and now it's behind a paywall subscription service. But that was really cool. I think the world needs some good news. The problem with it, of course, it starts trickling down to smaller stories about individuals you don't really know about, and I think a lot of people don't really care about that kind of news. But it is good to have good news in your feed, and it's good to see that out there, that somebody's doing it at least. So I wanted to start off, of course, the big thing coming up in the next few weeks is Halloween, and it's not something that we really celebrate, but I always wonder, I saw something this week, a sign up for a haunted house, but it was an asylum-based one, and I was just really curious. I'd always seen haunted houses, I'd seen asylum-based ones, creepy forest ones and stuff, but I always wondered about the asylum ones, like why are asylums creepy? There are video games where you can play, and anytime you approach an old hospital or an asylum, it's like the most terrifying part of the game. And in real life, we still do that. We base our haunted houses around asylums for some reason. So I did a little research into it, and I checked a few different websites, and they all seem to say something similar to that. The initial idea was that it was a safeguard or a safe haven for people who were struggling with whatever it might be, and a place for them to be set apart, which I think the word asylum comes from some Greek root or Latin root that means to be set apart in a safe haven, that they could just recover and then become members of society again later on, which in a lot of cases this didn't actually happen. What happened over time was the government funding wasn't just enough to support these asylum houses. What they also were recommended to by scientists and the general public was they opened the asylums to public tours where you could come, you could see the beautiful grounds that they had, check out the really unique buildings that they built, and of course pay to go and see the inmates who were in a lot of cases deranged and mental. And it was just kind of a way for the public to just see something new and the macabre and like just something that scared them. And so that's where it twisted itself pretty quickly into from a safe haven for people just into like a showroom for seeing people that are different than you. And so I did a little research into that, but there's some of the books that talk about it. I think this particular article, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, and then by Edgar Allan Poe, and there's another one that a lady had written called Mary. I can't remember the author at this moment. It was a rather long last name. But if you go read some of those things, they talk about like some of the experiences there, or like the fanatical, the fantasy side of it as well. But a lot of the asylums actually used their funds and things to like bring back in tourists, and a lot of the people, the caretakers, were actually very violent earlier in the day. So based on that, like over time, just the public perception of it was already kind of twisted earlier on, and it just kind of maintained that mindset that view and that perspective from the outside that it is just a dangerous kind of crazy place. So which is sad that there isn't like a safe haven for people who have that. And of course, it's good that in America we weren't dealing with it like some of the Russian counterparts or other countries that were trying to lock away or just eradicate some of these people. But at the same time, I don't think we've done a great job here, and in the way that we're treating it in the American perspective on the asylum is still messing with it. It still is a hindrance, as the psychologists say. It doesn't help the people who actually need the help because they have that viewpoint. That's a scary place, and it's sad that it has that. But anyways, that's a little bit of interesting information for you. So if you see asylum haunted houses, now you know a little why people think it is kind of crazy. Of course, there's all kinds of crazy. There are stories that come from. There are deranged people. There are lunatics, as they call them, and there are crazy things that some of the caretakers had done, some of the treatments that were just inhumane. And so that's a little bit of information on that. So we're going to move on to the next story. That's the big one that you've seen in the news a lot, is all about COVID, the vaccine that they're really trying to work on, and a lot of countries are. And one thing that I haven't really talked with a lot of people about is just the difficulty. And this article came up on the vaccine and like how difficult it is to produce a vaccine. And in most cases, what they're talking about is the estimated time frame takes about 10 years on average to produce a vaccine from beginning to end. Just like the Ebola case they talked about, that actually started in 2003. And when they finally got to clinical trials was around the Ebola time. What was it, 2012, I believe, somewhere around there in Africa. There were several countries that were having a really hard time with Ebola outbreaks, and that's when they were actually able to make a lot of progress with their clinical trials, just because of the amount of people that were contracting Ebola. And then shortly after that, I think it was about 2015 or 2016, that they finalized a vaccine that could help with Ebola. So in the process of making a vaccine, there's a lot of government oversight. Like, you don't want to mess something up like this. Of course, there's the entire anti-vaxxer side and the government like wanting to take care of an entire disease like they did with polio and like inoculate everyone. But so you have a lot of political problems and all kinds of other things, but just the production side of it is very complicated. Besides having to like deal with the government and trying to get everything done right and paperwork, that side of it, you also have like just the practicality of how difficult it is to make something like this, and then how many vaccines we're already producing. So that was another thing that I was looking into and this article just talks about, there are just a large number of vaccines that we're constantly producing. There's all kinds of stuff that we're working on, every disease that you've heard about in the past, that we're just still producing vaccines to like treat these people. And in the wake of COVID, we're already building factories all over the world. There are companies that are heavily invested in this, but at the same time, there's a lot of companies that are hesitant to do this, because whether or not you actually make money in the end game kind of is determined by your country of origin and some of the procedures that are in place. It gets a little bit tricky there. But one thing that I'd heard about earlier on in part of the anti-vaxxer debate was the Supreme Court. Now, this is another article. The Supreme Court rules in favor of protecting vaccine makers from state lawsuits. And this was back in 2018. And this, I knew about this rule that vaccine makers were protected from like malpractice or just like a bad design in a vaccine, and they had to pull some around this earlier than this time. But the reason that law is in place, because you're injecting things into your body, and there's just a large room for error. That's just inevitable. That can happen. But the amount of good that you can do by inoculating people and protecting larger people, like polio, for example, is a pretty good case of you don't want to get polio. And this case is one of those things that anti-vaxxers and things like that will go back to. Like, why would they have to protect the companies? Well, you wouldn't want to produce something if you can just get sued. Like, it'll cost a lot of money. Like, all the infrastructure that is being built to produce COVID is at risk, because you don't know which company is going to produce it first. You don't know which ones are going to be successful. And you could build all these warehouses and put all this management in place to produce something that you're just never going to see. That's always a possibility. It's a high risk environment. But I thought that was really interesting that there's those laws in place that need to protect those companies, because you're putting a lot out there to try to help people. And obviously there is a bit of big pharma. I know that there's some, whether there's conspiracy theories and there's some realities behind that there's some drugs being pushed. We know that America's like heavily addicted to Oxycontin and some of the other drugs, that steroids that make you happy or try to get past things that are going on in your life. But besides all that, I thought that was really interesting to think about. There's a lot of production in place, and there's a lot of complications into the matter from that side of things. So moving on, today's sponsor is self-sponsored. I designed this t-shirt. This is social distance service dogs. If you need a social distance service dogs because nobody's keeping their distance from you, even with your mask on, saying stay away during these times, you can get one of these t-shirts, or you can get the real thing. So of course that's a skunk on there. It will probably keep people really far away if you actually have a skunk, or you can just take your cat and paint it whatever colors it needs to be. So you can go check that out. The link is in the description. Of course, the links for all the things I talk about in this will be in the description, so you can read these articles and check on these things later on. And any funds from this will go on to help me produce this show. So moving on, you may have seen another interesting thing out. I am very interested in news that shows up and then you never hear about it again, and what the conclusions to those bits of articles that come across the news media, and I'm interested in what happens, and that's another thing that I'll be covering in our new news podcast with one of my friends, which will be hopefully starting in the next couple weeks. But this is one article that I'd heard a little bit about this conflict, and recently it's starting to escalate again, and between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and they call this about the Nagorno-Karabakh, which is, I may not have produced that correctly. And of course, why are they fighting? Like, what's up with this? Like, that China and India are constantly fighting. We hear about that a little bit now and then, but like, why are they fighting? And obviously it's over land, but what's the conflict? Why over that particular piece of land? So I did a little research on this. And so if you go on, if you're on YouTube and you can watch this, I'm zooming in right here. Armenia and Azerbaijan are like east of Turkey and just north of Iran. And between Armenia and Azerbaijan is that area, Nagorno-Karabakh, which is like this area. It's a large piece of land. And what happened back when the Red Army of the Russians came in the 1920s, they came through and took over this section and then annexed all of these Armenian people into Azerbaijan, which was the Republic of Azerbaijan, which was one of the Soviet states. And they took that large piece of land and just threw it into Azerbaijan. And now after the Red Curtain fell in the 1980s, 1990s, somewhere around there, the Armenia decided, like, well, obviously this is part of our land, you need to give it back. And Azerbaijan said no. And then they started a war. And this war and conflict has been going on for a very long time. Russia brokered a peace deal that I think it's been about 22 years that they've been moderating this peace, and they've had it there. But it's been constant, like just little shots. But recently it's become an escalated like conflict, and so that area is one part of the world that's like now you know a little bit more about like why these people are fighting. And I think this is a really good thing to think about when we enter a conflict like Iraq is a really important recent one, and Vietnam. When we enter a conflict in another part of the world, we're displacing people. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with what America is doing in trying to like promote freedom and democracy and trying to help out or fight our enemies and terrorists. But we also have to be careful because there are lots of long-standing traditions and cultures and people, like take for example, everything going on in Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and all the complications with the Muslim Brotherhood or all the different people. There are so many different levels of belief systems and cultures in there. You can't just like walk in and just divide a town and you suddenly end up with like a lot of remaining and long-standing conflicts, as in the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan. So that's just something to think about. I don't know that you can really do anything about it or that I can do anything about it, but it's good to know that when we look at the rest of the world, it's not like here. It's it would be a little weird, I think, for our perspective if somebody came here and broke up our states. And of course, like, that in general, like the Southeast is more Republican leaning, and then you have like California or the larger cities like New York and stuff more Democratic leaning. But if they're much closer and somebody like cut them in pieces where they didn't make sense anymore, we see some turmoil where people that aren't of the same ideology would have a lot of conflict. And that's kind of what you're doing here. Obviously, this is a little different with Armenia and Azerbaijan. That's a blood relative cultural type of thing, less of a political ideology. But we can't just go hopping around the world divvying up people as the Russians did and the Nazis did, and it doesn't usually play out too well. Another thing that I thought about earlier today, I'd seen, speaking of Iraq, was the Twin Towers. We'd gotten Chinese food somewhere, and they had a large picture on the wall of the New York City skyscape, and there were the Twin Towers, and I was just standing there thinking about that, like, that's a world that we'll never know. Prior to that world, obviously there's conflict, there were problems, there were riots, and there was a lot of humanity involved throughout human history, a lot of sin and a lot of problems in the world. But that world prior to 9/11 for me was something that like we'll never see again. I don't feel that we'll ever see again. The world is constantly escalating itself to a more dangerous scenario in some ways. But that was just something to think about for a minute. Before we end this podcast, we're just going to hop over to this YouTube channel. If you haven't checked him out, David Hoffman, I highly recommend watching some of this stuff. This is kind of what I was talking about with the world that we don't see or we don't know anymore. And if you're interested in like old-timey, interviews, this guy, he's about 70 years old, and he's been doing interviews for a long time. So he has some really interesting ones back when the computers first started becoming publicly available, and interviewing some of the people back then, like a young child or an adult, and what they thought about like what robots and computers and things like that could do, or how the there was one that was really interesting recently about the whole cultural or sexual revolution in the 60s, 70s, and what people then thought about like what they were doing. And it's really interesting to see a little bit of history from the actual viewpoint of the person that was in it at that moment. This guy, David Hoffman, is really interesting. He just does interviews throughout his life, and you may have heard of him because I guess he's been around for a while. But I'd say check out his channel, and I'll put a link in the description. You can check him out. And before I go, you can check out Teespring Store's Chattervast, and there's some merch there. Some t-shirts, coffee mug here, which I'll hopefully be getting one of these soon. If you'd like to support the show, of course, we have Patreon in the bottom. Like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, please. That helps out greatly. And if you are on podcast, please leave a 5-star review, and I appreciate it. And see you next time.